We had a stellar group some couple of months ago of youth talking about their experience on the Mucha court, Zimbabwean kids who are killing it out there, winning global competitions and so forth. We brought it back to the grown-ups today, where we are talking about the modernization of tourism in Africa. On our platform tonight will be 4 industry experts. I've got 3 or 4 at the minute. And as we do here, I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves so that you get to hear firsthand who we have, what they do, where they're based, and then we'll jump right into the discussion.
My name is Shelley Cox, and I am the owner of Africa Conservation Travel, a small tour operating organization that focuses on creating a greater link between tourism, conservation, and community development.
I'm Chimba. I'm the general manager for Victoria Falls Hotel, one of the oldest properties in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, which turns 119 years next year. I also wear a separate hat as the president of the Hospitality Association of Zimbabwe, nightclubs, hotels, lodges, restaurants, and sports clubs.
My name is Graham Simmonds. I work for Wilderness Safaris. We are an environmental lodge operator based in a few different regions, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Rwanda, and recently Tanzania and Kenya. The hat I'm wearing mostly is regional hospitality support for our operations in Zimbabwe and Zambia.
So as previously mentioned, we thought we'd unpack the modernization of tourism with a focus on Southern Africa. And I was quite inspired by this, I guess, growing consensus amongst practitioners, academics, and people more broadly in the ecosystem that is tourism. That is a tool, if used and directed properly, that has the potential, the power, if you like, to become a vehicle for both economic development, for job creation, environmental conservation, alleviation of poverty. The list does go on depending on who you're speaking with. Now, whilst these theories may work well in the West, we're not always very successful at ticking those boxes in Africa, and I want to understand why. But beyond that, I want to understand how we keep afloat and keep abreast of global competition. You know, we live in an increasingly competitive environment where if you stay behind the curve, it gets harder and harder to kind of go toe for toe with people who are doing well. So Asia has been able to grab quite a large market share in its tourism. And I want to understand what Africa needs to do more of in order to, as I say, go toe for toe and compete with our counterparts in Asia and beyond. And I'm going to give first honors to Farai in the true spirit of equal rights. Right, let me know. So you hail from an organization that goes back to the early 1900s, right? So 8th of June, 1904, Victoria Falls Hotel opens for business. I think modernization for your organization, and perhaps from your perspective, is going to mean something very different to perhaps Shelley and Graham and me indeed. Let me know quite briefly what your idea of modernization means for the tourism industry in Africa.
Coming from a property that has so much deep history, as you mentioned, it's about how do we transition from the colonial aspects and also from a deep history to bridging that gap to the now, which is for the modern traveler, the much younger traveler. How do we migrate that journey, not only in terms of what you offer as a service, but looking at the culture experience that you're going to give. So for us, what has been quite fascinating is looking at a hotel that has always been called an old property or a property for old people, and bridging the gap where we are now talking of a much younger population that's traveling, that can afford to travel, and it's not just your pensioners. But when I look at the more global aspect of modernization of tourism, I would actually look at what else now can we offer in terms of Africa or as a region. We are coming from a background that's very strong in agriculture. We're coming from a rich cultural background. So are those not the opportunities that we can start looking at and look at agri-tourism, ethnic travel and tourism? While we talk sustainability, it does encompass a lot of these things that we'll talk of ecotourism, agriculture, and cultural experiences. So for me, the way forward is looking at those other aspects that have been a strong foundation for us as Africa, and moving them forward to say, look, come and travel, but experience how we actually grow our Tanganda tea, how we actually go out there and live our day-to-day lives. There's so much deep cultural aspect we can focus on. You look at Zimbabwe, we talk quite a lot about the Victoria Falls, but we forget one of the main pillars of what this country is built around, which is the Great Zimbabwe. And that one of the most long-lasting structures outside of the pyramids south of Egypt. So those are some of the aspects that we now need to go and really put more focus on. We had quite recently a dinosaur skeleton found in Zimbabwe.
Really?
We have not made noise about that, but this is a 2-week find, which for us is quite remarkable. So how do we capture that and make that part of history and the modern world, creating that awareness for travelers? I summarized.
There's so much to unpack in what you've said, so I'm really excited about the direction of travel in this. Let's go to Graham with the same question. When you think about modernization, what does that mean for you and perhaps the properties that you're involved in?
So we obviously are an operator, so similar to Farai, who looks after Victoria Falls Hotel, but we quite a remote operator. So we have the same wish to stick to modernization, but in quite a remote area. So, for example, everyone traveling these days needs Wi-Fi. They want Wi-Fi. They want certain comforts. And how do we deliver that? Everywhere where you go, and which I'm sure in Dubai, and that you can get Wi-Fi wherever you are. But in some of the most remotest places where you have to access it by a small aircraft and you're going to a swampland, how do we maintain that comfort and that Wi-Fi level? So we've had to really look deep into our technology aspects and provide that, as well as going into food, which is quite a big aspect. As Farai was talking, almost farm to table. How do we make sure that we are moving with the trends? A lot of plant-based diets coming to the fore. So we're trying to make sure we're at the forefront of that. Before, when someone would come in and say they were a vegetarian, we had some really nifty salads we could whip up, but that's fallen away now. You have to really offer a proper plant-based diet for the vegans, vegetarians, and everyone in between. So it's trying to stay with the modern traveler, as well as attract new markets across the board. So single travelers, a lot of younger families coming for the modern tourism aspect, but also maintain the giving back. A lot of people traveling now are not necessarily traveling just to get the t-shirt and tick a box. They're wanting to know, where does their dollar go? How much of their dollar goes down to trying to assist people around them from the culture and the community aspect. So yeah, it's just about trying to stay on the forefront of all of that. So I suppose it's modern technology, food and comfort, and make sure we maintain the giving back aspect.
Wonderful. I love this. Now, Shelley, don't be upset with me putting you after these two, because a lot has been said already. But if you've got anything to add to that ecosystem, do let me know.
So I do actually, Mucha, and I think it kind of follows the chain of what both Farai and Graham have said. I think today's modern traveler is a lot more immersive. It's not a passive traveler, it's an immersive traveler who wants to get to know the people, the culture, the history. And you mentioned you're not sure if you want to go down that road, but I actually think it's taking control of our story as Africans based on the ground here, telling our story as opposed to having other people tell it for us, and owning our history. Zimbabwe is a prime example. Let's not beat around the bush. We've had our adversity, but it's owning that. What has come from that adversity is an amazing population of resilient, warm-hearted, welcoming people who go above and beyond because of the background that they've come from. So I think whilst Africa does have strides to take in various forms, I think Africa is definitely moving and shaping in terms of owning their own story, which is hugely positive. And I think, again, from an immersive traveler perspective, just adding to what Graham was saying, is previously a lot of travelers, I'm generalizing here because there have been philanthropic travelers who have come through in the past. But what COVID has done, if you want to find silver linings in anything, is created that awareness of the vital aspects of what we all as a globe have to do to protect our natural spaces, our natural heritage. And I think a lot of travelers, the modern traveler, like Graham was saying, wants to be a lot more impactful in a positive means as opposed to being passive. So I think there's a lot of exciting things.
Very good. I love this. And we welcome Mardre to our professional tribes. Maybe you could just quickly start by introducing yourself to our audience, just who you are, what you do, and then I'll jump in and ask you a question if that's all right.
Sure. So my name is Mardre Meyer. I'm the creative director for a studio called Source Interior Brand Architecture. We are based in Cape Town, and our specialist region is Sub-Saharan Africa. And we work with all of the big brands that are available on the continent. And with most of them, we're either the first or the only pre-approved African designs.
What I was going to ask you next then is, as you're aware, we're talking tonight about the modernization of tourism, focus on Southern Africa specifically. I just wanted to get a quick sense from you of how you would define or what you consider as the modernization of your sector.
Is I think that so much more immersive, and people are really, really interested in storyline, and they're always like little buzzwords that come around in this industry kind of internationally. And at the moment, everyone's obsessed with narrative and authenticity and story and storytelling and history and all of these elements. And our studios really built around our passion for this continent. And when I look at all of those principles, those are things that could actually really describe the heart of anything African. We have story. Like we're the one concept with all that story. The thing we just need to do from a modernization point of view is how we tell that story. Long we were told how to tell our story. And there are also many stories. We don't always have to keep telling the same one. Your story could be just about the piece of land that you're on. It doesn't have to be about a country, about the culture. It could be many things. Sure. That's what we're seeing, this need for really getting to people essentially want to leave feeling that they got to know someone and they made a friend and they can now say, I lived there.
Got it. Okay, that's really interesting. So I think contextually, we kind of have a fair idea of what we believe modernization to be. And in my own crafting of tonight's session, I was just thinking through some of the statistics that are out there. So if you think that the United Nations World Tourism Organization, UNWTO, in 2019 estimated that tourism was the world's third largest export category. And this is after chemicals and fuel, automotive products, and food. And that is quite a jarring statistic. And then that made me think, okay, the history of this sector is one that is kind of burdened, if you like, with perceptions of it just being the thing that people do, but governments not always perhaps taking it as seriously as it ought to, its potential not being realized as much as it could do. And then, as we said, talking through the history, of the African continent, tourism back in the early 1900s meant something very different to what it is today. So with that historical cap on, I'm going to go again to Farai, because I do want to touch on a lot of the work that you're incredibly doing with the Victoria Falls Hotel at the minute. And Arthur Harrison in 2001 wrote that the rise of travel was perceived as an opportunity for newly decolonized countries to gain needed foreign currency, generate employment and income, and to generally stimulate economic development, ultimately leading to poverty reduction. Now, if poverty reduction is at the heart of what we're trying to do, is there scope to be investing in modernizing the industry, or do we need to almost satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs before we get to this green, super conscious tourism model that a lot of people are advocating?
So, Mucha, I believe, you say very interesting statistics, because, just as when you look in 2015, foreign direct investment into Africa was about 54 billion, somewhere there. Of that, 39.2 billion actually came from tourism alone. So it tells you the impact of what tourism has as a potential in Africa. But what becomes of interest is the fact that with that, it also comes with the 9.1 million jobs that were created directly by tourism. you also have to remember that tourism is a very long and wide value chain. So in the process, what it will do is still create a job for the guy who's fixing the lawnmower, or innovation in supplying things into hospitality or tourism that then become part and parcel of that value chain growth in employment. So while it might not be directly in the operation itself, but what feeds into the operation creates a lot more opportunities. You also then look at the excess value chain that comes in from when somebody does visit, what opportunities are there to create community projects which can be sustained by you being in a particular space as a tourism operator. So I think the potential still remains there. With modernization also comes opportunities in other ways. And that's where innovation has to really kick in.
I love this. And these critical debates and controversies, I think, play such an important role in how we frame this narrative. In terms of how we sell the continent, Shelley, what's happening in the conservation space that you, if you like, would want to let our viewers understand a bit better? Because I don't think we all really get green tourism and get how it impacts the end users, which is that lady in the village down the road from Victoria Falls, for argument's sake.
No, I think it's a very, very delicate and sensitive balance. What we're talking about is the carbon from people flying over. What we also need to look at in modern tourism is avoiding the over-tourism. So I think it's a very sensitive balancing scale. But to answer your specific question about what I would say to people from a conservation perspective, a prime example, Mucha, is a lot of locals here in Zimbabwe will complain about the park fees, the national park fees. If you look at the size of Wangi National Park in its own right, it's the largest national park in Zimbabwe. Those park fees go towards national parks actually maintaining that space as a natural heritage for Zimbabweans, but also from a good global perspective. As a green space, green spaces are diminishing across the globe. And I think what people need to understand is that when people are coming and traveling to a destination like Zimbabwe, those tourism dollars don't just filter down to corporate structures. They filter down to national park fees, which sustain the national parks, sustain the employment. And also a lot more people are actually getting involved. What I mean, when Graham and I mentioned the immersive aspect and the people giving it back, paying it back, is a lot more people are actually getting involved on a much higher level than just your standard national park fees, and contributing to things like anti-poaching units who are supporting logistically the efforts of national parks, the forestry units who are protecting our forest cover, which is an important aspect on a global perspective, which kind of counteracts the carbon credit, the carbon that is being used to fly across the globe. Because I think the forest cover that we have on this continent alone provides a huge amount of benefit to the rest of the globe.
Brilliant. And that relationship between tourism and sustainable development is one that often comes up at the myriad of conferences that I tend to get involved in. Graham, coming across then to you with a similar question, I want to talk again about, so Shelley's talked about fees at national parks, and they're clearly feeding into something. What this conjures up in my mind is a dependence, if you like, on a small pool or on a low pool of revenue generation, which perhaps in other communities, other societies, other jurisdictions would come from an investor community. How do we shift the burden, if you like, to maintain these national parks from locals to the wider community or the investment community more effectively?
So there's I'll try and go into two aspects. The first aspect is obviously is maintaining the parks and making sure that they are attractive. So by maintaining those parks at the highest level, we can then charge a higher dollar or higher yield to attract those tourists to come and see. And then that has obviously got a drip down effect. We did, just talking about Farai touched on, I think you mentioned 9.1 million people that are employed through tourism in Africa. We did a study a few years back, and we found out that even though you can directly employ one person, the drip down effect from those dollars that person was earning went and touched four people directly, so in terms of school fees, food, providing, and things like that. the second thing and aspect is obviously moving away from, into areas, and I know it comes up a lot, hunting versus non-hunting and stuff. I'm not going to divert into that, because there's certain areas in Zimbabwe and vast tracts of Africa where people will go to hunt animals, and the only way to sustain those large covers of forest and stuff is if the hunters are there because of the animals. So I'm trying to put it together where Shelley mentions that we've got this forestry cover and we are providing lungs for the world, or a large aspect of it. But there's large parts of that forestry cover that is not protected, and it's getting chopped down. If you look at Zambia, for example, in the middle of the Kafue National Park, you get a lot of charcoal subsistence there. And where we are shifting to as a company going forward is looking at that carbon footprint and what we can do to try and protect that.
I love this. Okay, so we're touching quite beautifully on the environmental elements. When you think about luxury tourism, which all of you touch on to varied degrees, Mardre, I'm coming across to you now to just understand how we remain competitive in this incredibly competitive world where Asia's pulling all stops. They've got the funding, they're able to create some beautiful experiences for their tourists. How are we able to achieve the same, if not better, in Africa, given we've got the natural resources to leverage, but beyond that is the aesthetic of what coming on holiday in Africa might look and feel like?
I think one of the biggest evils we have on this continent is that we've been taught for so long that our story is a little bit simple and it's not got that much depth and that much layering. So for me, from a design perspective, it's really about us really seeing ourselves in the light first. Say our story is interesting, and we have lots of other interesting stories. Are we just animals? What about urban Africa? What about young urbanites? I think a new story, and I think that's what will make the difference.
Okay, so the African story, let's talk about the cultural tourism element. What is it about the culture, if you like? Let's go to you, Farai. How do we weave in the Zimbabwean culture into a Victoria Falls experience in 2022 compared perhaps to what it was like, say, 100 years ago?
The shortest answer I'll ever give you.
We can't. Tell me.
For what it comes down to is, when you look at the luxury market, it's understanding it. And cultural aspects of Zimbabwe is the uniqueness. And you've got to look at the exclusivity of what we do as a country or as a people. What is it? The warmness? Is it the experiences like what you're seeing at the back there, the decorations, etc.? Those are some of the things that people will come and experience. But over and above that is how you actually personalize all that, because that's what your luxury market is looking at. So it's us going back to telling our story in all its fullness, whether it's from the pre-colonial era to what we are now. I think that's what we should mold to create the culture that people can identify for Zimbabwe.
Go ahead.
So I'm working with Farai on some of those elements, and the layering I just want to add to that is, I think the tricky thing is kind of burdening a property with saying, how do we tell the Zimbabwean story? And that's not the whole story. It's about telling the Victoria Falls Hotel story. Because in its own story, it's got great things. It's got a great vegetable garden. It's got wonderful trees. It's got a fantastic collection of historic twirling grass. So it's not the responsibility of the hotel to tell the story of the country. And it's the story of its actual location.
I was going to say, because luxury is different. Luxury is changing. Luxury to some people might be having an air conditioner and however many quilted threads and carpets and everything like that. But to some people, luxury is just being able to get away from their high-rise buildings and their hectic life and be able to go and sleep under the stars on the platform and make sure they've just got a bottle of water and a nice warm fire and that. And there's people out there that are multi-millionaires, and they're actually seeking this now, particularly post-COVID, because they've realized how short one's life can be, and they need to start to experience and get back to what they so luxury changes. I think that's where particularly I'm sure Farai will agree with me. It's quite difficult to put a one paintbrush for luxury, because some people want that. They want that, all that extra food and the fastest Wi-Fi and a television in their room, and other people are like, no, you're burdening me with this, you're charging me for stuff I don't want. Just give me the stars, give me the wildlife and an authentic story.
it's taking control of those narratives, as we were talking about, and focusing on the story of the people. Like those, yes, townships can be dangerous. Where in the world do you find a city or a town that does not have some element of crime or danger? You know, looking at aspects where it is luxury to be able to go into a place like Khayelitsha, I believe, to go and experience that, learn about someone else's inspiring story where they have come from poverty and elevated themselves, upskilled themselves through various means, and have created a business where their coffee beans, for example, are being exported. I mean, that's a phenomenal story in itself. And that is the stuff, the emotional aspect. If you look at all the research that has been done post-COVID, people are wanting to travel. They're wanting that emotional experience to connect with people, reconnect, learn more about what our world is really about, because there's so much bad news out there. People don't want that. And there's so much good news that isn't told. There's beautiful stories in Africa. And I think that's where the narrative and the storytelling is so important. And I think bringing back to the question of what is luxury is we have to tell that story, and we have to appeal to the different types of travelers, because not everyone, all of us on this platform might be different travelers. What I term luxury is wide open spaces, wildlife, authentic, immersive. I don't really need all the fancy things that go with that. And that for me is luxury. That is where I feel connected to the earth.
This is fascinating because you've got, I guess, a natural association of luxury being indulgent, right? So for a person to, I can think of many people actually who couldn't imagine anything scarier than going into a high density area in South Africa, in Africa, elsewhere, because the media constantly bombards us with these perceptions of Africa being violent at the best of times, being ungovernable, and all these factors then kind of remove the value of some of these experiences that you're talking about. And, you know, when we place a value on luxury being lying under the stars and enjoying nature in its absolute majesty, there is perhaps a reluctance or a lack of information that inspires people to want to explore that and to consider it a luxurious experience rather than, oh, I went to slum pit and, you know, this is me sort of doing my bit for for the poor lady in Khayelitsha, for instance, which isn't quite where we want to go to with this. So how do we successfully navigate then this perception story? Vic Falls Hotel, Farai, the bit that I was going to just tag on to your response was, people typically fall in two camps. So you'll have that tourist who is affronted walking into the hotel because it is full of reminders of a colonial past. You've got somebody who will revel in that because they think, wow, this is such a deep history. What are you doing to kind of balance and put a more local or a 2022 spin on this depth of history that sits with the hotel?
So from a product side of things, it's that migration of retaining the essence of what we've always done as a property in terms of the decor and styling, but at the same time saying what's the functionality that comes with the modern traveler that will appeal to a different person. The other side is really putting it out more into the market that, look, it's somewhere that you can still enjoy to experience. I think that's where the uniqueness of luxury travel also comes in that can you actually come and have that experience and take a leaf from what you've gone through as a history. I think one thing very prominent is you can't delete history. You can't change it in terms of what it is. It's happened already, but what you can change is the future.
If I could just add to what Farai was saying, is Victoria Falls Hotel is actually the flagship property. Sorry if I offend any other operators in Vic Falls. but it is the flagship property of this destination. And part of that is because of the history of it. You know, all of us, when we are talking about Victoria Falls and we mention Victoria Falls Hotel, that association of the grand old lady comes forward. But that is what has made it So you, like Farai said, you can't deny that history. She is the grand old lady of Vic Falls. She is the flagship property, and you can't. You can move with the times and diversify. I mean, they've made an amazing wine cellar where that's new. They're diversifying the wine cellar experiences that you can do there. So they have been diversifying the offering that they give inside the hotel. But that history is what makes it so connected between the past and the present and the future.
Mardre, I was going to say, you've got a challenge, right, as a designer, to go in and try and balance delicately all these elements. Talk to me about what you're doing, or what your thought process was with this task.
Exactly. So the point we've all kind of driven is that this is the history, but as we know, even just with people around the table, the same thing will happen with all of a slightly different take on it. And that's really how we have to view it. To say, many years ago, we would have told that same story in a different way. All those elements are there. It's about how we curate those now to tell the story of how that affects us right now. So we've got a fantastic pool, a fantastic location. We've got a wonderful garden, and sure, that garden, the trees there might have been planted by people that Rotary treated very well, but it's left us with a great legacy of wonderful garden. So they tell that story of wonderful garden and how we own that right now. I think there's also something to say about the value of the respect of that things might not have been great and how everything got there, but to make good on that, we are owning it, we're taking it forward.
Graham, let's go across then with about 10 minutes or so to go before we call time on today's session. I want to talk now about moving forward and modernization from an ICT perspective. How do we move with the times and ensure that people who may want to come and plug away from Dubai, come work from Wilderness Safaris, one of your properties, know that they can come with their laptop and they'll be okay?
No, so obviously we do our best. We do our best to provide something, but we also trying not to have people come and pay their hard-earned money to sit behind a laptop and actually miss out on the front. When they leave, they leave a bad review because they didn't go on a game drive, or they didn't get stalked by a lioness or lion, Mucha. So we do our best, but it is hard because in some of these areas it is so remote. You're off the beaten track. You're a 45-minute flight from the nearest town, and that town itself might not even have internet. To be honest, long answer there is we haven't found the happy medium. But what we try and do is make sure that guests are experiencing what they're coming to see, and also being able to stay connected to loved ones, work, and business entities.
Okay, so we know that for people to kind of know what to expect when they come through, if you were to give a elevator pitch for tourism in Southern Africa, what would it be? I'd like each of you to just kind of give me what you consider your top sales pitch bits for anyone who may be watching this, uncertain about whether they would be adventurous enough perhaps to come to the south of Africa. Let's motivate them. Let's start with Shelley.
I think for me is the incredible landscapes that this continent has, and the diversification in terms of those landscapes. You can go, I'm going to use Zimbabwe to hone in on, sorry, Mardre, Cape Town is beautiful. And it's also diverse in its own right. But Zimbabwe, you can go from Vic Falls to Wangi, to Metopus, to Mana, to Gonarozo, and every single landscape is unique in its own right. And every single one of those landscapes has the ability to make you realize how small we are in the grand scheme of things. And I think that feeling in itself, in the world that we're living in, is what is so attractive. But first and foremost, it's the Zimbabwean warmth that is probably the biggest attraction to this destination.
I'm on my way, Shelley. Say no more. I'm on my way. I love that. Let's go across to Mardre. What's your pitch?
It's a very similar one to Shelley's, really. Is I think that, as I said, there are many kind of like talks on this idea that we've got to just own ourselves, own what we are again. We have got warmth. For me, the most important is we've got people who smile, who are wonderful, despite their circumstances. We've got the most wonderful people in Southern. We've got those wonderful stories. We've got landscape. We've got sunlight. We've got fresh water. We've really got all the basic things that everybody needs, but in the most inspiring way.
Love, 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 love. Graham.
Yeah, Africa's got everything, and it's got an original and authentic way. Someone once told me that Africa's not a destination of a lifetime. It's actually a lifetime of destinations. You can keep coming back, and you can always capture
Let's
something.
bring it on. Bring it on. I love that. Okay.
Yeah. So you can visit it many times and still rediscover yourself and rediscover something else. And then I guess around the fire, the one time we're sitting and they were multi-repeats. They were chatting to a first-time guest, and they said, "Oh, how are you enjoying it so far?" And they said, "No, we're loving it." And then the multi-repeat guest said, "Oh, actually, yeah, it's really expensive, but we keep coming back." And the first-time repeat came back and said, "It's not that expensive. I've been on more expensive holidays." And the repeat guest turned around and said, "Oh, you think this is the last time you're coming? You're going to be coming back again and again and again." Yeah.
Sure.
So I suppose that's the way to just sum it up. We have everything in Africa, and it's just waiting to be explored.
Grand. Farai.
Right. Look, for me, at the end of the day, it's Africa as a whole, Southern Africa, whether it's Vic Falls, it's Cape Town. I think we sit with a lot of undiscovered experiences, which we still can share to the outside world. Our story hasn't been told yet. I think we pretty much on page 1, first paragraph, and there's a whole volume to complete.
Okay, so in the spirit of what this particular conversation was, let's move the same exercise to modernization. What would true modernization mean for the industry across Southern Africa? All right, Mardre, why don't you go ahead?
I think it's a bit of a layered thing, because there's modernization, like we spoke about, that things to do with technology and all of that. But I think modernization is also something we have to really kind of redefine for ourselves, which is our more modern value of how we look at ourselves. So, for example, at Victoria Falls Hotel, architecturally is a particular building. So, like in the bedrooms, we use carpet patterns that felt Edwardian, but really were based on African patterns. So, we're saying we're looking at Africa in a more modern way, but we're looking at Edwardian things in a more African modern way.
Well, there you have it. Not just about technology. And I think that's a really powerful point, for the fabrics, the textures, the colors. We've got so much vibrant stuff to leverage across the continent. And I'm not sure, we weave it enough into our storytelling. And our storytelling is visual, it's sound, it's taste, it's scent. There's so many elements to it. So I'm absolutely loving that idea. Shelley, what's your take on this?
I guess what I want to say about modernization is more of a personal hope and a personal dream, is that for me, what modernization would look like is more of a global responsibility towards these amazing landscapes, which are so vital to the health and well-being of our planet and ultimately to all of us and our survival. So a greater responsibility to our future generations would be, for me, the ultimate modernization.
I love that. Absolutely love that. Graham?
Yeah, echo what Shelley says. If you look at what Patagonia are doing now, I'm not sure if any of you followed that. Recently, they've signed off to 2 trusts. So basically taking the commercial entity of where we used to be like, let's see how much money we can make, pay employees lots and just keep making more money. People have realized you can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have an environment to sustain the human species, you're not going to have anything. So something like, as Shell says, into more of a responsibility. I think modernization also in terms of our African context is maybe ease of access. We're kind of in the middle of the world, but access can be quite tricky. It's quite expensive. If we can modernize and have more people visiting to a degree, obviously we don't want to go into mass tourism, but we also need to be very, very careful with modernization. As we mentioned, luxury can be deciphered in different ways. So can modernization. I'm sure there's parents sitting out there that are have their kids at the dinner table, they don't talk to them anymore because the kids are on their cell phones. Or when I go out to a restaurant, sometimes you see people sitting there and they just like a couple and they've got their cell phones and they're not talking to each other. So sometimes modernization might actually be going to a place where you don't have that internet Wi-Fi at the main area, so that you actually have to sit and start talking to your loved ones again. So just got to be careful. Modernization, I think, can be a circle where everyone rushes to the fastest broadband and internet because they want to put their Instagram stories up or do a TikTok video. But then on the other hand, they also, modernization to an individual might be reconnecting with a loved one or a family member.
From what you look at in modernization, it's also now looking at what are the trends that are shaping the landscape for tourism. So is it more about places, more about vacations or leisure, which is business and leisure? But there are some key elements, things like wellness, that's part of modernization in the landscape of hotels. Obviously, the digital experience is something that everyone looks at. But sustainability and personalization, I think, sit top at that modernization trend.
I'm quite keen to talk about how we infuse our values, our culture, food, and I talked about sounds, sights, smells, textures. How do you kind of preserve that in this context of modernization? Because if you're attracting, I guess, clientele from the West, we're used to a certain way of doing things and maybe a little bit reluctant or maybe a bit concerned about the culinary experience. How do you kind of make sure that you still infuse culture, but make it appealing to a cross-section of clientele?
It starts off by it being authentic. I think everyone traveling to any destination wants to experience something that's authentic to that particular place. You can have a burger anywhere in the world, but how do you make that burger relate to where you are? Are you making it out of local ingredients that are unique? When you talk of vegetarian, for instance, it's everybody then starts thinking automatically it's chicken in some cases, you don't eat beef, but in reality, there's a lot of other things that can be infused and incorporated. So how you make it authentic is quite key. And at the same time, I think when you look at from a sustainability point of view, how organic is your produce? About storytelling, how can you make the food the story behind your identity as a property?
The Victorian Falls Hotel is a great example of this. You know, it's when you're saying we don't necessarily have to burden local with this whole history and the culture and it has to represent the nation. Local could also be a very simple thing. At the Victorian Falls Hotel, you used to on arrival guests in your room fresh fruit and vegetables. And what we've developed with Farai over time is they have the most wonderful mango trees. So, you know, you don't get dried mango from the garden. So it's local from there.
I've got my notes running here, but I do not want Graham to be attacked by a lion as he leaves where he is to get back home. So we will wrap up. And I think in my final considerations, certainly, the things that spring to mind range between how does Africa, these are the sorts of questions that unfortunately we haven't had time to touch on, but certainly worth considering. How do we transition to a model that allows for, I guess, a cross-border experience for tourists coming through, so it's not just the Zimbabwe story. You're looking at Southern Africa as a region holistically, but make that ease of passage straightforward. Your borders are friendly, I guess, to tourists going from point A to B. Is that something that, very quickly, is that something that exists, or would it be a nightmare to think, okay, I'm going to cross over to Botswana and Namibia, etc. if I come to Zim?
Mucha, I think on that one, there's already in motion the Africa Continental Free Trade area. That, for us, that becomes the key thing in allowing access between the various countries. East Africa done it so well by having a common visa. We have sort of like taken one foot into it by establishing the CASA visa between Zambia and Zimbabwe and also Botswana. But once you those barriers to travel, Africa does have potential for not only intra-Africa travel, but also make it easier for national.
Couldn't agree with you more. Okay, super. So tonight we have talked about a host of modern considerations for the tourism industry, everything from wellness to the economic benefits to technology, culture. The list does go on quite a bit. And I am absolutely excited about my next visit to Victoria Falls and surrounding areas because you know, you can never, a bit like you were saying, Graham, with these repeat travelers, you can never get enough of some of these destinations. And if you don't have it on your bucket list, then you've got the wrong bucket list. Really, just a last, I guess, question for each one. What is your favorite destination in Southern Africa? Shelley?
Probably gonna get shot on the street tomorrow by someone in Zimbabwe. I'm joking. Wangi National Park, without a doubt, is my favorite destination on the earth.
Okay, Graham?
The bush, sorry, I'm going wide. I'm fortunate enough to travel to different regions in Africa, and I can't pin it down. Just put me in the bush and I'm in my happy place, reconnect with Mother Nature, reconnect with myself.
Now, for anyone who doesn't understand what we mean by the bush, because this is a real thing I've come to discover, explain, please. Bush is absolute wilderness.
I'm not sitting in a bush. Yeah, it's being in the wilderness with the natural order. You suddenly you're not top of the food chain anymore. You can have wonderful luxury surrounds around you, but you get to witness Mother Nature in her raw core, what it's all about, and you start to realize that as humans we actually aren't at the apex. You can tip that whole model upside down and realize that we're at the very bottom and rely on Mother Nature. So,
Mardre, favorite destination?
I'm going to have to give you two, and they're going to be a little bit abstract. So the one that's my most warm and fuzzy.
You're a creative. If you didn't give me abstract, I would think that I went terribly wrong on this conversation with you. Please go ahead.
Exactly. So the one that's my kind of warm and fuzzy is where I grew up. It's the beaches of the Southern Cape in South Africa. They're beautiful long stretches. They're wonderful. But literally, really my most powerful place that I've kind of experienced is Zimbabwe. It was in Nyandoro. It was just unbelievable. It was kind of like what Graham was saying. It was just this wild space, but it wasn't at all threatening. It was wild, but we weren't. Like I think people always go like, if we say wild, it's going to be elephants and all that. It would also just be wild with greenery and smaller animals.
Farai, over to you. Your closing remarks on favorite destinations.
It's the Vumba for me and going to Tony's coffee shop. That does the
I went to Vumba and I didn't know about Tony's coffee shop until I left. So this is on my list.
The best cake you'll ever taste in your life, and try their chili hot chocolate. It is phenomenal.
Chili hot chocolate, interesting. Okay, there I've got another one to aspire for. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, first of all, to our professional tribe for talking to us about the modernization of the tourism industry in Southern Africa. We've had industry experts Shelley, Graham, Mardre, and Farai giving us some insight on what the industry is like, what modernization looks and feels like, but how to remain conscious, how to remain, I guess, how to preserve, if you like, the African story, the African narrative, without kind of changing it too much and creating a mess out of it, quite frankly, which is a very delicate balance, that balance between really giving Africa in its beautiful rawness, but moving with the times at the same go. So phenomenal professionals on the platform talking through all things tourism. For those of you who've joined us online, thank you. I know that most of you have not been around for a while and you may watch this after the fact. Please do keep your comments coming through. Any questions that you have, we'll look to address them offline. In the meanwhile, you've been told where to go to for your next holiday. Christmas is around the corner. If you're thinking of somewhere different to go to, Zimbabwe is calling your name, she says. I look forward certainly to my next trip there, lady and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been a pleasure having you on Professional Tribes.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Mucha. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys.